This is House Planning Help episode 192. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Michael Holmes, and we're going to be looking at the right to build legislation. Have you heard of it? Are you looking for land? This could be useful for you today. So what is it? How does it work? We're going to dig into all of that in a few moments. In the early part of the podcast, I always like to share a resource with you, something that may aid you on your journey. It could be a video, it could be a website. And today I thought it made total sense that I should recommend home building and renovating to you, because I have been a subscriber probably for a number of years now, and I enjoy sitting down in the few moments I can find to have a flick through. It's very accessible. They also have their shows that are at various places throughout the UK, so that's very helpful. I've got my tickets to the latest one, just because you actually can go to a lot of these shows in the early days for different things, and then when you come to specification, you're once again looking at products, so that's why we're heading back to Excel for that. We pinched a few of their experts, don't tell them that, to have a chat to over the years as well. People like David Snell and Jason Orme. So yeah, have a look, home building and renovating. We'll put the website in the show notes today. So Michael is not only a TV property expert, but director of content at Home Building and Renovating and chair of the National Custom and Self-Build Association. So I was interested to find out how he got into this sector.
My background in housing started when I was PR for the first ever self-built home show in 1990. So I've been in the sector now for 27 years. I was responsible for the PR and marketing campaign for the National Self-Built Home Show, which was held at Alexandra Palace, I think in 1990. Wow. And in the process, I learned all about people building their own home and went from thinking this was something that was for the sort of open-toed, sandaled, bearded brigade to thinking this is incredible. I mean, how many opportunities are there in life where you can have your cake and eat it? Because with self-build, not only can you design your own home and have a bespoke property, but there's also the opportunity to save money. I thought that is truly exceptional, and I can't see why everybody isn't doing it. And I've been hooked on it ever since.
Very interesting. You said save money. I'm going through this process for the first time, and I think it's almost impossible to save money as I am doing it. I'm probably doing it completely wrong. So have you been through this yourself? And I know you've done it lots of times on TV, but you've actually built your own home, or have you renovated? What's been the main staple for you?
I have been through 27 projects. I've not lived in all of them, but my property ownership career and sort of hands-on experience started out in London. I bought the property I was renting with my now wife, and we renovated the property on an entirely or almost entirely DIY basis and project managed the remaining elements. And we did it because it was the only way we could afford to improve the property we were in. And we spent a lot of evenings and weekends, pre-children, when you do have that kind of time on your hands, improving the property and also improving the value of the property. When we decided to leave London and move out to Oxfordshire, we sold the property, and it left us with a big enough deposit to be able to buy a building plot. And so we moved out to Oxfordshire, very quickly found out we were expecting our first child, built our own home in Yarnton in Oxfordshire, in Cherwell District Council, interestingly, currently probably the leading council when it comes to custom and self-build with the Graven Hill project. But back then, it was a relatively less common thing to do. But we bought a very small plot that happened to have a paddock next to it that we bought, and we put the two together and managed to get permission for a quite substantial house overlooking open country. Built it, took us about a year and a half building it, project managing it, working in conjunction with a builder who we then went on to work with again, and lived in it literally for 12 months, by which time our second child had arrived. And we'd gone from buying a plot with 2 incomes and no kids to having built the house, gone over budget, 2 kids and 1 income. And so we decided we had to sell. But what we were very pleased to discover was the house was worth considerably more than twice what it cost us to build. And that there pretty much transformed our lives and gave us completely different horizons and different outlook on what we could achieve and where we could live and our broader prospects for life. It is utterly empowering building your own home, not just because you put the roof over your own head, sit back and look at every angle, every corner, and knowing you've designed it, knowing you've created it, but the fact that you have far more equity in your home because you've built it yourself and save significant amounts on that build cost. We then went on to do a major remodeling renovation project, then another self-build, and now another remodeling and renovation and extension project. So we've been through quite a few. We are now project managers rather than DIYers because time doesn't permit us to do DIY labor. And actually, the job you're best spending time on is being a really good client and being ahead on decisions and making sure that you know exactly what you want. And that doesn't waste time with builders and subcontractors changing things later.
I know that David Snell is one of your contributors at Home Building and Renovating, and he's been through the process actually building himself a home a number of times. That's got to be unusual, though, hasn't it? Most people, once you've done it... It is
unusual. I think it's very common for people who do one to then go on and do it again, because when people first think, building your own home, my goodness, that sounds very daunting. That sounds hugely ambitious. Once you've done it, you realize just what you can achieve in life and just how feasible it is for people to do. But you've got to remember, this is something that's very, very common across most of the developed world. On average, about 39% of homes are commissioned by their owners in the developed world, with the exception where only 8% of homes are commissioned by the owners in the UK. People underestimate their abilities. As for the number of people going to do 14 self-build projects like David Snell, they are very few and far between, it has to be said. But the second one, I think a lot of people feel they've learned the first time and second time around they're going to get it right.
You mentioned there about the state in the UK. So how do we end up there that we've got this very low percentage of owner-informed houses?
I think the roots of it are very possibly in the fact that we have very limited land ownership in this country. 90% of the land is owned by 10% of the people. And if you go back a century ago, that was even more exaggerated. So popular home ownership just didn't exist in this country until the 1920s and 30s, when it started becoming more mainstream and people decided that home ownership was something that ordinary people could achieve. And that was particularly transformed through Thatcher's Britain during the 1980s. So the concept of home ownership as a relatively new popular concept in this country per se in itself. The idea then of building your own home is even newer to us in this country. So I think in many countries, if you wanted a house built, there weren't the volume house builders in place. So you had to go out and buy a piece of land and build it yourself, which, of course, if you go back, wind the clock back a century or two ago, almost every house was built by the owners, either to live in or to rent out. So owner commissioned housing versus developer-led housing, speculative built housing, is something that was in our roots and DNA only a century or two ago. So we've lost it somewhere along the line and maybe lost a great deal more in the process. And only now is it coming back to thinking, well, who's best to design the house? Well, it's fairly obvious it's going to be the people who live in it. And so I think the reason we have a largely volume house building led sector in this country goes back to land ownership, and then from land ownership it goes back to the need to build large scale housing and the fact that the state took that on post First World War and the Homes Fit for Heroes, large scale public house building, and then that was gradually taken over by large scale private sector house building. And that suited the town and country planning system of 1948-49, in which they had to identify the pieces of land you could build on and the pieces of land you couldn't build on. And that's kind of a plan-led, socialist-based system of a command economy. And we still have a legacy of that today, that the planning system very much restricts where you can build and where you can't build, and finds it a great deal easier to grant planning permission on large tracts of building land, strategic sites, than it does on tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of individual plots. There's a great deal more work involved in the latter, and it's an awful lot easier if you're tasked with creating or identifying enough land for house building for the next 4 years. It's a great deal easier if you draw a red line around half a dozen fields than try to identify 4,000 or 5,000 individual plots.
How do we transition then? What's it going to take?
Well, The self-build sector, as we've known it in this country, has largely been infill sites, replacement dwellings. It was bumbling along at 15 to 17,000 for many years through the 80s, the 90s, and the early noughties. When the credit crunch came along, we saw what happens if you withdraw specialist finance products, and the sector dropped by about a third, down to about 10, 11,000. It's now recovering to 13,000 in the last financial year, just over 13,000. But it's never going to get much above that 16, 17,000 figure that we saw back in the 80s and 90s, just if the houses are built on individual plots, garden plots, infills, replacement dwellings. To take it to the sort of level that you see overseas, you need to bring far much more land to market, far more plots to market. And that's never going to be achieved with those windfall sites. There are only so many replacement dwellings. There are only so many infill plots and sites of rounding off. The transformational change will come through serviced plots. This is the way it works overseas, where you take those large strategic sites or those small and medium-sized sites, you subdivide them, you put in the infrastructure, you put in the roads, the sewers, the streets, the street lights, the high-speed broadband, maybe even the district heating and combined heat and power, local combined heat and power systems that are very ecological. And then you sell them off to individuals. And probably at one end, you have spec builders offering a finished house for those who want that. At the other end, you have DIY plots for people who want to buy a plot and build their own house. And in between the two, you have house builders saying, well, tell us what you want and we'll build it for you. And then you just let the market decide, let customers, the house buyers decide which they want most of.
Do you think that the self-builder of the mindset they are today wants to be on a site with other spec builders? They might be happy with self-builders, but is that the right approach, or will we immediately alienate a lot of people?
That was the $1 million question of the right to build, which we can talk about later. And the right to build was about registering demand for custom and self-build and then placing a duty on local authorities in England to deliver enough planning permissions to meet that demand. And clearly, a great many of those sites are going to be on large multi-plot sites, serviced plots. The evidence from overseas is that there's a market for it and that people are very happy to live on a plot with other self-builders and other spec-built houses, in fact, want to be part of a community and like the idea that the two difficult parts of a self-built project, getting out of the ground, the unknown cost of foundations, and the cost of bringing services and infrastructure to a site, are dealt with by a service plot. You know what you're paying for the plot includes groundworks up to slab level and includes the infrastructure, the services and the road. So it actually makes it less risky and much easier to access for the majority of people. There will always be those self-builders who probably already have access to the market who want the one-off plot with the amazing views. But those plots are expensive and always will be. So if you want a bespoke home, but want it at an affordable price, but don't want to buy an off-the-shelf house by a major house builder, then this is the way of accepting choice. We did put this to the test and put an Ipsos Mori survey out of 2,000 members of the public. And the feedback was that there is, yes, significant demand amongst those 1 million people who say they'd like to get on with the self-build project in the next year. A significant proportion of them were willing to live on a site with next door to other house builders, a multi-plot site. So yeah, I think the answer is yes. It won't suit everybody, but it will suit a different market, and especially those who are finding it difficult financially to access the self-build market of garden plots and infill plots. They will suddenly find that there are plots available for them to build their own home on these multi-plot service plot sites.
Let's go through this then, the right to build. What is it? How does it work if we want to take this up?
The right to build is a legal duty placed on every local authority in England. So we're currently saying it doesn't apply to Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, although NaCSBA, the National Custom Self-Build Association, is talking to the devolved governments in each of those countries. Currently, each local authority in England then has to maintain a register of people who want to build their own home, looking for a serviced plot to build their own home, and then has a legal duty on a rolling 3-year basis to grant sufficient development permissions to meet that demand. So what it does is, for the first time, force local authorities to recognize that there is demand for custom and self-build, something many have chosen to ignore in the past, and then to actually do something about meeting that demand by having policies or working in conjunction with developers or housing associations or landowners or anybody in the sector to either facilitate the land coming forward, or indeed bring it forward themselves by either using public sector land that's already owned by the council or the HCA, or indeed going out and buying plots and creating those service plots themselves. And this can apply across all tenures. So this doesn't just meet the demand of the grand designs generation, people who ambitiously want to build their own one-off house. This applies to people who are looking for rent. It applies to people looking for shared ownership. It applies to group self-builders, community-led housing, apartments, flats, right the way through to those one-off grand designs houses. So it really is a broad spectrum of people looking to put their own roof over their own head because they want to do that through individual design, or because they want to do it in a more affordable way by investing their own sweat equity.
This may not be the finished scheme that I got involved with, but let's rewind, say 3 years ago, I signed up to something that I thought was along those lines, and it all went very quiet. So can we monitor this situation? And if nothing happens, who do we then speak to?
So 3 years ago would not have been the right to build, because it was launched on April 1st, 2016. Mm-hmm. And the duty for local authorities to meet demand on a rolling 3-year basis didn't commence until 31st of October 2016. So this is something that's very, very new. We've not yet seen the full first year of the registers. What we do know is in the first 7 months, April 1st to October 31st, 2016, through a Freedom of Information request led by NaCSBA, we know that 18,000 people signed up on the registers, and we're hoping that in the first full year that ends this October 2017 will be over 25, somewhere between 25 and 30,000 people on those registers. So it's still very, very early days. What we do know, though, is that this has been in the pipeline for some time, and that there have been 11 vanguard right to build local authorities for the last 3 years. And also the GLA in London have been working on trialling right to build through experimental planning policies and other initiatives like Graven Hill at Cherwell, which is a site for 1,900 custom and self-built plots. So there's been momentum out there already, and ahead of the right to build, some other local authorities like Plymouth City Council have been very proactive about custom and self-build. So what we did see in 2016 is a 24% increase in planning applications for individual new dwellings. So quite a significant increase year on year between 2015 and 2016. We're talking about something like 18,000 applications for single new dwellings. So significant growth, even ahead of the right to build really starting to take effect. So I think we can see that the number of plots coming to market is already growing and will continue to grow. In terms of its impact on the right to build portal, which is a website that links through to every local authority's demand register, NaCSBA is posting the number of people on each register on the link page for each local authority. So you can see how many people are registered there. And that will be updated again following our Freedom of Information request work to find out how many people are registered in 2017. So government are very ambitious about this. They want to double the sector by 2020, and have made it clear in the draft white paper, or the white paper on the changes to the National Planning Policy Framework for England, that if they don't start to see the numbers getting to where they want them to be, the 20,000 number by 2020, they will take further legislative action to push the right to build. What has definitely happened is a growth from the low point of 10 or 11,000 post credit crunch in about 2010. We're now to over 13,000 in financial year 2016. So it's going the right way. It's growing at just over 6% a year. And with the right to build starting to kick in, we're expecting that rate of growth in the sector to accelerate.
What sort of commitment are we making by putting ourselves on this register?
You are not actually committing to anything unless you're charged a fee. The statutory instrument that was introduced last year does give local authorities the right to charge for entry on the register, which I would encourage local authorities not to do if they want to get anything like a true picture of demand, because actually getting people to know about this, then getting them to come to the website, then getting them to sign up is already quite a good filter as to whether people are serious about this or not. Local authorities then have the duty to bring forward enough development permissions to meet that demand, but it doesn't actually mean that they're going to pass a permission for a particular plot with you with you in mind, and your particular needs in mind, or your particular location in mind. It will be in the local authority in which you're looking, and there will be a plot permitted to match your demand, but it doesn't mean you need to buy it. It doesn't mean at the moment you'll necessarily even be aware that a plot's been granted against your demand. It's a bit like school places in that, they work out how many children of each generation age group there are, and then the local authority across the local authority group has to make sure there are enough school places made available. But it's up to you to identify the school you want to go to, and there's no guarantee you'll get into it.
So is there a way that we can remove our name from this register? Because we're probably not going to use this as the only avenue to get our piece of land.
Yes. I mean, if you write to the local authority and ask for your name to be removed, your name will be removed from the register. And so, your data can be removed at any stage. Incidentally, that data is not available in the public domain anyway. It's data that's kept by the local authority.
And this might have changed since I filled out R1, but there was a lot of information. It might have been something like 8 or 9 different pages of questions. So what's it looking like these days?
It can be very, very simple. Again, that's up to the local authority to decide what their register looks like and how much information they ask. They can keep a 2-part register. The first part of the register is open to everybody in the EU, including Switzerland, and that is the register that counts in terms of assessing demand. There's a second part of the register that can ask further questions. For instance, it could apply a local connection test to decide whether or not you could be prioritised for a plot that's being brought forward perhaps by the local authority. And then Shropshire, for instance, has a local connection test for its exception site policy, which allows local people to build in the countryside if they get local support, providing it's an affordable size and value home, and is retained in perpetuity through a legal agreement, a Section 106 agreement, so that if you do decide to sell it on, it must be sold on to somebody else who also meets that local connection test, and it must be sold on for at 65% of market value, so it's retained in perpetuity as an affordable home. So there is the option there for them to apply a local connection test for whatever needs they see fit, and also the option to apply a financial affordability test to see whether or not people going on the register can actually afford to be able to build their own home. But neither of those things mean that you don't go on part 1 of the register, and neither of them mean your demand isn't counted in the assessment by the local authority in working out how many plots they must grant permission for.
How long are we expecting this process to take? If we did think that this is the only way I'm going to build a house, I've put my name down, do I just wait and wait? Do we think 3 years, 5 years?
Well, 3 years is the test, the legal duty upon local authorities to grant permission. If they fail to grant enough planning permissions to meet demand in those 3 years, and you can demonstrate that demand is there, then I think there'll be a very strong case to apply for planning permission on a piece of land that might not ordinarily have received planning permission, and use the fact that they've failed to match demand with the number of permissions they've granted, and that would be a material consideration in determining whether or not to grant permission on that site. Rather like where a local authority has failed to meet its 4-year land supply, or 5-year land supply rather, developers are able to bring forward sites outside the local plan and quite often get permission, even if it goes to appeal, on the grounds that the local authority has to grant consent because they've failed to meet their target for a 5-year land supply for housing. Similarly, with custom and self-build, at the moment there are many, many plots brought forward that are just outside settlement boundaries that are refused. I think if a local authorities fail to meet demand on the custom and self-build register, that those plots might well get planning permission. It remains to be seen how inspectors will treat this and what weight they'll give to the Self-Build and Custom House Building Act, but certainly we expect it to have weight in those planning decisions.
We've all been keeping our eyes on Graven Hill, so is there anything that you have learnt that might be useful to share here?
My view of Graven Hill is a fantastic, ambitious project. They could probably build it out and deliver it faster if they combine self-build, custom build, and spec build. If they're really looking just about deliverability, that probably isn't the principal objective for them. I think they're looking to build a custom and self-build community, and I think it's a very admirable project. There are other opportunities for developers within Cherwell District Council. They've got the Garden Village. They've got quite a few other sites. So they've also got the airbase at Upper Hayford. So there are plenty of choices for people who want to go and buy a speculative built new build house out there. So keeping Graven Hill back for custom and self-build, I think, is a really admirable project. I think it's important to make sure that they meet all forms of demand as well through shared ownership, through apartments, through custom build, and through pure self-build. And they are beginning to do that stage by stage, making sure that they meet all the different aspects of demand within the custom and self-build sector, because there are many, including groups. And I know that they are also looking at whether or not to work with group self-builders too.
So NaCSBA, I think I'm right in saying, is almost 10 years old now, and you're on a bit of a mission. What are the challenges that you're facing? I imagine this is your core policy, but in trying to make things happen on the ground.
I think the number one objective now has to be a consumer campaign to let people know about the right to build and let them know that this is something that is attainable, that is achievable. I still think it's quite remarkable that as one of the wealthiest and most advanced countries in the world, that we can't build enough houses to meet demand, and that many people are sharing, many people are living in substandard housing, many people who are working cannot afford to get on the housing ladder. It just seems quite remarkable that we aren't able to bring forward enough land and enough new homes for everybody to have somewhere decent to live. And while self-build and custom build are by no means the only solution, I think they're a significant part of the solution. If we could get anywhere near delivering 39% of new homes through custom and self-build, as we see elsewhere in the developed world, we'd go a very long way to helping solve the housing crisis. To achieve that, we need to make sure people are aware of the opportunity and that it's something that's realistic for them to take on. We need to have, alongside new build sites and the existing housing stock, service plots available widely across all areas where people want to live. We need to have a network and structure of custom build providers and builders who are able and willing to build those houses for people quickly, efficiently, and cost effectively. We need to have finance products to meet that demand, including demand from people who perhaps want shared ownership and can't necessarily afford to buy the plot outright at the moment based on their current income, but perhaps buy it or lease it and then just pay for the house that they build on there. So we can really boost the volume of house building in this country and get people living in the homes they deserve.
So you've got your work cut out for you.
It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be quick, but we are determined. We've got a fantastic board on NaCSBA. We do have the ear of government and all parties. We are talking to the government in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. We can turn to Europe, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, anywhere you look, and point towards the way new housing is brought forward in those countries. I don't see why the members, the public of the United Kingdom, are any different or should be any different, and why we shouldn't have high quality, affordable housing stock for everybody in this country.
You're clearly on a mission. We're cheering you on here. Keep up the good work, and thank you very much.
Well, very nice talking to you. Very nice talking to you, Ben. Thank you for having me.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session, houseplanninghelp.com/192. You can review the main information. Perhaps you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question. Well, you can leave that in the show notes. Just head down to the bottom. Also links to NaCSBA, the National Custom and Self-Build Association, Home Building and Renovating, and to Michael on Twitter, all at houseplanninghelp.com/192. My call to action today is that if you found this episode or others in our series useful, please leave us an iTunes review. That is assuming you're listening in iTunes. It's still the largest podcast directory, so that's why I mention it there. If you're listening on Stitcher or one of the other apps, then I'm sure there's a rating system there, and a review would go a long way. It just gives people a flavour of what this podcast is all about and whether they want to download and get stuck in. So thank you for that. They don't have to be long reviews either. Sometimes just a sentence will help out in a big way. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.